Insomniac Games is probably one of the biggest names in gaming when it comes to superhero games. I mean, when you look at what this studio has managed to build with Marvel's Spider-Man, Spider-Man 2, and now Marvel's Wolverine, it's honestly pretty crazy to think about what they're working on behind the scenes. And what's even crazier is that if all the current information, leaks and reports are accurate, Insomniac's superhero line-up could potentially take us all the way into the PlayStation 6 generation. We're talking about Wolverine, Spider-Man 3, and eventually a full X-Men game. So yeah, there is a lot to talk about here. Let's start with the projects that are either confirmed or have been heavily reported, and then we'll get into what Insomniac could be building towards in the future. First up, we have the next major Insomniac release, Marvel's Wolverine. The game is currently expected to release in 2026, and honestly, this could be one of the biggest superhero games of the year. We already know that Wolverine is going to be a third-person action adventure game. And from everything we've seen so far, Insomniac appears to be taking a slightly different approach compared with the Spider-Man games. The game is expected to feature multiple semi-open world areas rather than one giant open world, which actually makes a lot of sense for Wolverine. And of course, we're going to be exploring Logan's story, but the really interesting part is how deeply this game could connect to the wider X-Men universe. We're expecting multiple villains, different characters from the X-Men universe, and potentially some major story elements that could lay the groundwork for Insomniac's future X-Men project. There is also some interesting information surrounding a potential sequel. According to reports regarding Insomniac's Marvel agreement, there is apparently a sequel clause that could give the studio the flexibility to continue Logan's story if the first game performs well, and more importantly, if Insomniac has a compelling reason to bring him back. Obviously, none of that guarantees Wolverine 2. But if the game becomes a huge success, I don't think anyone would be surprised if Insomniac eventually wanted to continue Logan's story. And that brings us to the next project. The next game we're going to talk about is Marvel's Venom, Lethal Protector, which has reportedly been targeting around 2027. Now, this one is a little more complicated. There have been rumors that the Venom game was canceled, especially after Insomniac went through major changes behind the scenes and the planned Spider-Man 2 DLC was reportedly scrapped. For a while, there was basically no information about Venom, which obviously made people assume the project was dead. However, reports from notable leakers have suggested that the project is still in active development. And if that's true, it sounds like the game may simply be arriving later than originally planned, potentially with a much larger scope. One of the most interesting rumors is that Venom could act as a bridge between Spider-Man 2 and Spider-Man 3, and apparently, the game could feature as many as 3 playable characters. Now, that's a pretty big deal, because if Insomniac is genuinely expanding this game, it could end up being much more than a small spin-off. There is also the possibility that some of the ideas originally planned for the cancelled Carnage DLC could have been moved into the Venom project. And honestly, that would make a lot of sense. The Carnage storyline was already heavily connected to the symbiote plot in Spider-Man 2, so moving some of those ideas into a larger Venom game could allow Insomniac to properly explore them rather than simply squeezing everything into DLC. There's also another really interesting detail involving the late, great Tony Todd, who voiced Venom in Spider-Man 2. There have been claims that only a relatively small portion of the recorded Venom dialogue was actually used in the final game. If that's true, then there's a huge amount of unused material that could potentially be relevant to a future Venom project. Some reports have suggested that the unused material could involve the Life Foundation storyline, including symbiotes such as Lasher, Riot, and Agony. Now, we obviously need to treat these reports carefully because none of this has been officially confirmed, but if Insomniac really did record a lot of Venom material that wasn't used, then it's certainly possible that some of those ideas could eventually return. We could also see Yuri Watanabe becoming more important. Her storyline was already connected to the symbiote events in Spider-Man 2, so having Yuri involved in a Venom game would actually make a lot of narrative sense. And potentially, she could even become a playable character. And that brings us to what could be the biggest Insomniac superhero game yet, Spider-Man 3. According to current reports and leaks, Spider-Man 3 could arrive around 2028 or 2029. The game was reportedly planned for an earlier release, potentially around 2027, but with Wolverine releasing in 2026 and the reported Venom project taking up development resources, it makes sense that Spider-Man 3 could have been pushed back. And honestly, I think that's probably a good thing, because if Insomniac is really planning what we're hearing, they're going to need a lot of time. Spider-Man 3 is reportedly being treated as the big conclusion to the current trilogy, and we're not talking about a small ending here. We're potentially talking about an enormous crossover style event involving multiple villains, multiple playable characters, and several storylines that have been building since the first game. Green Goblin is expected to be one of the biggest focuses, and potentially the main antagonist. But that's not all. Dr. Octopus could return. Carnage could still have a role, Venom could potentially return. And then we have characters like Cindy Moon, who is expected to become Silk. If Silk becomes a major part of the story, I wouldn't be surprised if she was playable as well. And then, of course, there's Peter Parker. After the events of Spider-Man 2, Peter has stepped away from being the main Spider-Man for a while and allowed Miles to take on more responsibility. But eventually, Peter is going to have to come back. And I think Spider-Man 3 could be the game where we see him return to the center of the story. Miles, meanwhile, could be much more mature by this point. He's already been protecting New York on his own, so by the time Spider-Man 3 happens, he could be operating much more like an experienced Spider-Man. If the Venom game really does act as the bridge between Spider-Man 2 and Spider-Man 3, it would make perfect sense for Eddie Brock's Venom to appear in the third game. He could potentially be playable during certain missions, or even become an unlikely ally against Green Goblin or another major threat. And if Insomniac really wants to go all out, we could even see standalone DLC after Spider-Man 3. Which brings me to something I think is very important: post-launch content. Spider-Man 2 originally had plans for additional content, but those plans were reportedly canceled as Insomniac shifted its resources towards other projects. And, understandably, a lot of fans weren't happy about that. So, if Spider-Man 3 really is the grand finale of this trilogy, I think Insomniac will probably want to make it as complete as possible. More missions, more characters, more side stories, and potentially major post-launch content. Basically, they have one final opportunity to finish this version of the Spider-Man universe properly. And I wouldn't be surprised if they went all in. But here's where things get exciting. After all of these games, we're potentially heading towards Marvel's X-Men. This is the project that could take Insomniac's Marvel Universe into the next generation. The X-Men game has reportedly been planned internally, and there have been reports suggesting that Insomniac's Marvel agreements extend well into the 2030s. The game is also expected to be a PlayStation 6-era title, which makes sense considering how far away it could be. Some reports have suggested that the X-Men game could arrive sometime around 2030. And if that's the plan, then Wolverine is basically laying the groundwork for the entire thing. We're potentially looking at characters such as Wolverine, Jean Grey, Cyclops, Mystique, and Professor X. And personally, I really want to see Gambit. I mean, come on, if Insomniac is making a full X-Men game, Gambit has to be somewhere in there. What's particularly interesting is that the game has reportedly been described as a story-driven single-player experience featuring more than one character. That could mean something similar to what Insomniac has already done with multiple characters, but on a much bigger scale. Maybe certain missions are designed specifically around individual X-Men. Or perhaps players could choose different characters for certain missions, giving each character their own abilities and gameplay style. That could add a lot of replayability. Imagine playing the same mission as Wolverine, then going back and playing it as Cyclops or Jean Grey and getting completely different combat options. That could be absolutely brilliant. Of course, all of this depends on Insomniac's plans actually staying the same. Game development changes constantly. Projects get delayed, concepts get reworked, and sometimes games are canceled entirely. So we shouldn't treat every leak as confirmed information. But even with that in mind, the overall picture is pretty insane. Because look at the potential timeline: Wolverine in 2026, Venom potentially around 2027, Spider-Man 3 around 2028 or 2029, and then an X-Men game potentially entering the picture around 2030. That's potentially an entire decade of superhero games from one studio. And who knows? Insomniac could eventually decide to make something completely different. Maybe Daredevil, maybe Punisher, maybe Iron Man, maybe another character we haven't even considered yet. And if their Marvel universe continues to grow, there's always the possibility of these characters eventually crossing over. Honestly, that's probably the most exciting part. We're not just looking at individual games anymore. We're potentially looking at an entire interconnected Marvel gaming universe built by Insomniac. So, yeah, the future of superhero games is looking pretty damn exciting. But now I want to hear what you guys think. Which game are you most excited for? Wolverine, Venom, Spider-Man 3, or are you waiting for the X-Men game? And if Insomniac really does make another Marvel game after all of this, which character would you want them to tackle next? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe for more gaming news, rumors, and updates. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.